Good afternoon. In April this year, Nigeria rebased its economy to become the largest in Africa, overtaking South Africa's economy in terms of GDP. Several weeks later, Boko Haram seized headlines worldwide by abducting nearly 300 schoolgirls in northern Nigeria. In June, Kenya's $2 billion bond offering drew $8 billion in orders, making it one of the most successful bond offerings by any government from Africa ever. Days later, militants launched terror attacks against civilians in Lamu County, threatening to make the World Heritage Site of Lamu Island a no-go area and damaging Kenya's vitally important tourist industry. And last week, a leading U.S. newspaper, which I'll go unmentioned for right now, ran a story about the traffic problems that might be caused in Washington due to the Africa Leaders Summit, and then quickly pivoted to quotes from a federal official assuring Americans that the Ebola outbreak in West Africa poses no significant risk in the United States. These paradoxical developments reflect the challenge that Americans have in understanding Africa. Once dominated almost exclusively by notions of war, extreme poverty, and health crises, today many people in the U.S. increasingly see Africa for its business opportunities, its technological innovations, and amazing tourist destinations. However, it is important to ask whether American perceptions of Africa are really changing, and what more can be done to accentuate the positive news coming from the continent. At the same time, how do we sync American perceptions of the continent with African efforts to address development challenges while the African middle class continues to expand? Also, how can Americans work to end the various conflicts on the continent and to eliminate extreme poverty while not perpetuating outdated or inaccurate views? And finally, what is the role of youth in Africa and the U.S. in changing how Africa is perceived? My name is Whitney Schneidman, and I am a non-resident fellow at the Africa Growth Initiative at Brookings and Senior International Advisor for Africa at Covington & Burling, LLP. And I warmly welcome each of you to this very important and I hope interesting conversation. To help us sort through these complex issues, we have a most distinguished panel. We have Amadou Matar Ba, who is a co-founder and chairman of All Africa Global Media, known to most of you, I hope, as allafrica.com. We have William Wallace, who's Africa Affairs Specialist at the Financial Times, and for 6 years, the Financial Times Africa editor. Next to me is Helene Cooper, who's the White House correspondent for the New York Times and author of The House at Sugar Beach, In Search of a Lost African Childhood, which was a New York Times bestseller and National Books Critics Circle finalist. We also have John Prendergast, co-founder of the Enough Project, a best-selling author, and a renowned human rights activist who has worked for peace in Africa for over 25 years. Wow. And we're also pleased to have Akon, the 5-time Grammy-nominated recording artist and philanthropist who established the Confidence Foundation that benefits underserved children in Africa and the United States. Before I turn to our panelists with some questions, let me note that the event hashtag is #AfricaSummit, and that those following along on Twitter can submit questions under the hashtag. And once we've had some initial comments and some back and forth, we will open up for your questions. So the title of the panel is A Changing Dynamic, Africa's Image and U.S. Perceptions in the 21st Century. And let me start with Amadou of All Africa and ask you, Amadou, from the African perspective, what's your role of how Africa is being covered? What's your view of how Africa is being covered here in the United States? Do you think we're getting the right story? Are we stuck in images that emanate from the Cold War? Or are we able to understand the new Africa that is emerging?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for the question. Look, we've got to start from the premise that indeed Africa is complex for anybody, whether you're African, from Senegal. I'm from Senegal. So Swaziland is totally different. Now, the realities of the continent are complex. So for anybody to really be an Africa specialist, so to speak, and comprehend everything, all the complexities of this over 30 million square kilometers, over 100, over a billion people now, I mean, this is very difficult to do. Sure, there are some challenges that the continent faces, and sometimes those challenges you can find them, in different parts of the continent, which are the same. But also at the same time, a lot of opportunities, obviously. Now, the reality is there's a difference between the reality and the perception we have. Now, Africans themselves have also sometimes a difference between the reality and the perception they have of not only their own country, but also neighboring countries. So I won't blame an American or a European or a Chinese if they don't have the right perception of what's going on in Africa. Now, the reality also is all this have been, changing gradually. Not there yet in terms of really getting to the details of the complexities, but, the needle has been moving. And you've got to say there's a proverb in Africa which says really, till the lion knows how to tell its side of the story, the tail would always glorify the hunter. So now, obviously, if you try to transcribe it in today's world reality, what it means is Africans also need to know how to tell their stories. Let me just give you an example. Here we are. Everybody is saying this is a great event this week in Washington, D.C. All these head of states, all these delegations here. Now, you would have to count who are those head of states who have actually framed their story before coming here. Almost nobody did. I think President Gebozo sent us an op-ed, but that's about it. You can't imagine President Obama going somewhere without giving an interview to that country, okay? It's all about framing the story. And we've got to actually frame the story, the narrative of the continent more and more. The good news is, and I'll just lay it down there. So the good news is you have more and more professional media houses on the continent. Some of them are actually represented here. I saw the CEO of the Nation Media Group. For you guys who follow Africa, Ernest Gitahi, he was around here. I saw my friend Omar Ben Yedder also. But the second aspect is actually the social networks. I mean, you have young, dynamic people. I'm not even young per se. You have the young people, but not so young, who are actually on the networks, putting out their Africa, and not the Africa which is perceived from here or from China or from somewhere else.
That's great. Elaine, let me turn to you. You grew up in Liberia, but you've been here in the United States for a long time. You covered the White House for the New York Times, one of the preeminent journalist positions in the United States. So you know Africa intuitively, intimately, instinctively on the one hand, and you're working for a major newspaper. How do you think about African stories when they come to you? Do you feel a certain pull, I should report it this way because I grew up there, or I just have to get it out? How do you wrestle with that?
I've been thinking that I'm going to probably be your worst panelist today because in part I feel like I have so many different identities and so many different roles. And when you start talking about the way the Western media portrays Africa, I get defensive because I'm with the Western media. But I also have so many frustrations with the Western media and how the Western media portrays Africa because I'm African and I'm also American. So I've been like all over. Just listening to your introduction was like a case study in 3 different personalities for me. It's been, it's a really, I think when you start talking about the whole issue of Western perceptions and the perceptions particularly in America, of Africa, it's such a complicated story. It was, I moved from Liberia to this country. We moved to Knoxville, Tennessee in the 1980s. And I remember it being the first couple of years being so incredibly hard because at that time, as far as the kids in the high school I was in were concerned, Africa was a country. They were constantly pissing me off by asking me questions like whether or not we used to live in a tree. And I had the worst attitude possible because it was completely inconceivable to me that I knew as a Liberian everything you could possibly know about the United States, and these Americans didn't know anything at all about Liberia. I didn't understand the why of it, and I remember seeing, you know, Out of Africa won the Best Picture award, and I got pissed off because it was about white people and not about Africans. And then to make matters worse, Cry Freedom came out, and it was about my hero, Stephen Biko, but it wasn't really about him. He was reduced to a bit part in his own murder, and it was actually turned out to be about Donald Woods, the white reporter who reported it afterwards. And I think we've come a long way since then. You know, you've seen almost like a cultural revolution. There's been a renaissance. You see, instead of like the African literature, for instance, being solely the province of, you know, Alan Paton and the white South Africans, or even Karen Blixen, we see this new crop of African writers. You see Chimamanda Adichie, you see Taye Selassie, who are telling a very distinctly African story. And I think that gets to what Amadou was saying about Africans being able to tell our own story, and that's a challenge that we need to take up as Africans. But I think we're getting there. I also, though, think that the media and the Western media, of which I'm a part, has a long way to go. When you brought up the Ebola story in the Times last week, it's amazing to me that this has been going on since March. As of by the time we got to July, 1,000 people had died of the disease in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia. It wasn't until 2 American missionaries caught the disease that it exploded onto the front pages and on the evening news here. And that's a question. That's something that I think the Western media has to wrestle with ourselves about how we cover Africa and this need we have to constantly Americanize every African problem and issue that is not relevant to us until we can find a Western face to put on it. But I think it's also a challenge for us as Africans to figure out our own way to tell our own story.
Akon, let me turn to you. You're unique for many reasons, but from my point of view, being a native Wolof speaker and being born in St. Louis, and probably there's nobody better on the planet who understands image and perception and reality and how to shape image. So when you look at how Africa is portrayed today, and given your intimate knowledge of the continent, what do you see? And your work with various artists, your own work, what are your thoughts about how we should change Africa's image, or how to go about getting a more balanced perspective? I know you're not a news person, you're a recording artist, but what can we learn from your experience in that respect?
Well, I think ultimately, no matter what you're involved in, the system doesn't change. It's all about marketing. The thing about Africa is that we have a history that's untold, even though it's told, but it's been told in so many ways, and it's been told from the likes of others who've marketed themselves to become leaders in their own universe. So when you look at a place like Africa that has so much history, so much resources, so many, just as the culture of it, everything out of Africa has been adapted everywhere else to build there. But we've never utilized what Africa has to build Africa. So it's almost to a point where because we have, even though I was raised in St. Louis, my mother and my father and all of my family are Senegalese and were born and raised in Senegal. We were the only generation that came to the U.S. My dad made sure that we were all born in the States, so that way we wouldn't have to deal with immigration issues like how he dealt with it trying to get over to the States. So shortly after we were born, he sent us back to Africa. And then Senegal is where I was raised up until later elementary, then moved into junior high, middle school, and then from there, I just stayed in the States, and then frequently came back and forth. But I noticed that the more I went back, I could never understand that after so many years spent in the U.S. and then I would go back to visit, that nothing would change. It was kind of mind-boggling for me that I would leave a place for 5 years, come back in the same corner, and that same Coca-Cola bottle is sitting right by that sewer. And it made me think a lot about advancement and what advancement actually means. And one thing I've realized as I was growing forward is that as Africans, we can allow ourselves to be in a position where we're comfortable. Because what happens is Africa has this aura that's just so loving, and it's one of those environments where you're happy because everything around you just feels good. So it's almost like when I was a child and I was running around, playing soccer barefooted, living in the straw huts, what we call negunya, and I was happy. No electricity, no water. I was completely content and happy with what I was, experiencing until I got on that plane and came to the U.S. and saw that they were better. So it all boiled down to more of the education of what was being installed in the minds of the youth growing forward. Because ultimately what happens is when you have leaders who are used to being in office for like 25, 30 years, you're not going to get a change for the next 25, 30 years. Because there's only one mind and one vision. So I always felt personally that democracy itself is going to be one of the key things that help Africa move forward, because unless you change the line of power every so often, the mindset is going to be in the same as the person that's leading now. Ultimately now, when you're swapping out these leaders, a new person will come with a new vision, new attitude, new environment, and new experience. And through that, new laws will be built out. More than anything, new bills will be written out. But more than anything, especially in Africa, the people have to focus on the youth there. I mean, as I'm moving around, I hear it a lot. Yes, Africa, we have to focus on the youth, we have to focus on the youth, we have to focus on the youth. But anything major that's coming apart that's related to Africa, there's never no programs for the youth. And Africa, 65% of Africa is built and ran by the youth as we speak. The population is more youth-friendly than it is adult-friendly. So, and they're in a position where they see the change. They see what needs to happen. But we're constantly being pounded with the history, which keeps holding us down. And it was a funny thing that I was having a conversation with a group of friends, and we was talking about how we teach our children. And a gentleman mentioned how important it was for his children to know their history. And I kind of contradicted to it. Yeah. And he couldn't understand why. Well, you're raising your children wrong. They should know what our people went through, this, that, and the other. One thing I realized as I was growing up in the United States in the early 80s, everything was blamed on the white man. If nothing happened for you, or you couldn't get a job, or you couldn't get an opportunity, the white man is holding us down, this, that, and the other. But yet you have a continent that's free and clear, wide open for business, wide open for opportunity, and you can be treated equally without the headache of what you think is holding you down. But yet you don't even take the time to explore what's over there because of the fear that was installed in you, and not even realizing that you can get there with this. It's the same distance from New York to LA. It's the same distance from New York to Senegal, and possibly the same ticket price. And yet you still haven't been there. You don't even know what it's like. You don't even care. Matter of fact, the more, I'll say, negative news that comes from the continent that is exposed, the more it keeps you away. So the media actually plays a bigger role than anyone thinks, because what we put out there is what comes out to the people, and ultimately the people naturally believe what they see and hear on television. So the responsibility of anyone related to the media is so much bigger than they can ever imagine. Ultimately, so when it comes back down to the marketing, it all comes back to what we want people to see. When I came in as an African, no one could believe that an African was a rapper or a singer or an R&B artist that was an A-list artist in the same lines with the Whitney Houstons and the Michael Jacksons and the Lionel Richies and so on and so forth. They were like, impossible, he's not African. And it was a strategy because I had to conceal the fact that I was African up until the point where I got so ahead that they couldn't stop me anyway. But that was the only way that I could actually advance, because when I first came out and put a record out for the first time, I wanted to inherit my African roots. I wanted to let people know that I'm African and this kind of talent actually exists on the continent. But I realized that no radio would play me. BET, which is Black Entertainment Television, told me that I wasn't urban enough. Then MTV said, well, I'm too urban. So where do I fall in the middle? How do I adjust? So I just said, okay, well, I was born in the ghetto, I've been locked up, and I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. And it worked.
Yeah. Hey, Con, let me just pivot to John here, and play off that for a second, because John, you have you spent virtually your whole career on the African continent. You spent a fair amount of time in the headlines, on 60 Minutes, working with media a lot, and projecting a lot of what's happening on the continent. And your focus has been on conflict resolution. And you also work with some of the most identifiable people in the world, George Clooney, Ryan Gosling, and others. And how do you balance sort of your work, your vital work on conflict resolution, whether it's Sudan or the Congo or Uganda, and in terms of the larger message coming out from the continent?
First, let me just say how weird it is to have been listening to the iPod this morning and then sitting next to the guy who I was listening to. And he's even smarter than the lyrics, which is weird, because usually somebody else is going to be writing the lyrics, but it was definitely him. So, but I think, I was even thinking about the origins of this U.S. Africa summit. It isn't just that President Obama went over to Africa and sort of had an idea. There were years and years of organizing by constituencies in this room, perhaps watching this on the webcast and outside all over town and all over this country and in Africa. Years and years of people building constituencies in support of a deeper and broader and more respectful and equal relationship and engagement between the United States and Africa. I think about constituencies, the NGOs obviously, but the private sector's played a huge role in this. Church and faith-based groups in general have played it. Student groups who aspire to a better relationship and a deeper engagement by the United States in Africa. And of course, as part of all that, celebrities play a huge role. I mean, we have a culture that is very, very interested in what people like Akon are going to be eating for breakfast. So if he and some of the people you mentioned and many others become interested and engaged with what's going on in Africa, it will bring more and more people into at least contact with some of these issues. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to learn the right things, but it gives them an opportunity. It opens doors. And I think back also to what moved the needle, what changed the course of human history here in our country, and it's always been popular movements. It's the civil rights movement, the labor movement, the environmental movement, the women's movement, LGBT, all these different, and then that's just for domestic purposes, but also popular movements have helped internationalize social change. When Americans connected with South Africans on the front lines of apartheid in the anti-apartheid movement to help transform that situation there, where Americans helped link with people in West Africa and Sierra Leone and Liberia and even Angola during the Blood Diamond years to help bring about some change there. So popular movements are really where things are rooted. So I think that's where those folks that have a high profile, that have distinguished themselves in their artistic endeavors and have an audience, and the light is coming like it's coming at us right now with those spotlights. The light is coming at us, and people like Akon have taken the mirror and just shifted and say, okay, look at this issue, and listen to these people. I think that's when I've seen it most effective, is when a celebrity goes into a country that they often know very little about, and I'm talking about some of the Americans that I've traveled with, and they're learning and learning and learning. But instead of saying, well, this is what the history is, let's have this person tell the story from that country. So really giving a platform to Africans to tell their own story that they wouldn't otherwise have in the international. They have a voice, it's just amplifying that voice.
That's great. William, you spent 6 years as editor of the Africa editor at the Financial Times, so you got to decide what's in and what's out, right? And how did you make your decisions? I mean, granted, it's a business newspaper, but still, how did you make your decisions or what stories you wanted to tell?
Well, I think because it is a business newspaper, it's for an audience of policymakers and businessmen, essentially, there's a need to cover a real breadth of stories from all sorts of parts of the world. So you can't ignore the politics, you can't ignore security issues, and you certainly can't ignore business, and you certainly can't ignore the economy. So actually, in a way, the Financial Times is kind of modeled to cover different parts of the world in a fairly similar way. The problem with Africa has been, in the past at least, that the Financial Times requires a bit of scale. You want billions, you don't want a million, in terms of the actual money that's moving. You want market-moving stories. So in the past, for example, a lot of our business coverage perhaps was in somewhere like Nigeria was focused on oil. More recently, the key has been to identify trends. So because not every deal is huge, although you're getting some really big deals now happening, you need to identify the trends in order to cover the business of, on the continent. But I think one of the big challenges is, and I think this applies to all the media, is actually how few journalists we have on this enormous continent. You've got 55 states, and a lot of we're working with 4 bureaus if you include Cairo, and it just simply isn't possible to cover the ground. And there's a flip side to that too, which is in the age of the internet, you have a huge array of different sources of information potentially on the web and sites. But actually, it's very deceptive because there are so few journalists, there's a kind of homogenization of news because one single wire reporter in a country, say in Bangui in Central African Republic or Kinshasa in the DRC, can really set the whole news agenda because, he may be one of 2 foreign correspondents. This is obviously changing because the African media has developed so much. But it's still an issue that the news can be set by so few journalists. So in terms of deciding what we cover, if there are big crises, it's very hard to ignore them, particularly when they're in strategic states. So that tends to soak up resources. If there aren't, then there's a lot more scope for what we can do. So I think the FT has had quite a blend of stories. I think a lot of the Western media, however, is still kind of hardwired to cover conflict on the continent and crises.
Right. So how do we get to where the positive story, I guess, sells? Isn't that what it comes down to? What's going to sell newspapers or
well, sorry about that. What it boils down to is that conflict is what sells.
That's right.
It's partly that, but I think it's
the economy
also...
is just one big business.
But see, this is what we're trying to push back against, because if that's what sells, that becomes the image. So how do we get the other stories? How do we get the news story?
I slightly disagree, because I think it's also an issue of which voices are loudest. And if you take this country, and it's fairly similar in Britain as well, the voices that are loudest on Africa have tended to be the faith-based groups, human rights lobbies, and NGOs, and the very effective and noisy character on my left, John. And because their focus has tended to be conflict resolution, then you've got a lot of focus on that in the media as well. Equally, I don't think there's a voice yet in this country that is really effectively pushing the business story in Africa that's talking about the real transformation in the continent's relations with the outside world that has taken place over the last 15 years,
Right.
largely as a result of China's engagement.
So one of my perceptions of this summit, the African Leaders Summit, is that trade and investment is going to move to the forefront of the U.S. Africa agenda. You know, Obama had that meeting in Tanzania last year with CEOs. He's doing it again for a day-long event tomorrow. It's going to be one of 3 items on the agenda Wednesday with the head of state. So it seems to me that the dynamic is shifting. Helene, is this something that can really get reported about and written about?
Up to a point, yes, but I think the trade story has been, for more than a decade now, the only other story that there is outside of conflict in Africa. And you know, let's face it, it's not just Africa. The news media, we cover conflict. That's what we do. It's news. It's not news if it's like we don't like good stories. People call me up and pitch. Why are you just focusing on the negative? Why don't you write this? And I don't even hear them. It's just noise. So news. That's the definition of news. So we're always going to flock to the conflict story, and in a lot of ways we should, because it's not just because it's what sells, but it's also oftentimes this is what is important, and there's usually some underlying cause there that needs to be reported. That said, the trade story. I used to work for the Wall Street Journal, and trade was my beat. And I always was constantly looking for, you know, because at the Journal, they basically said, you have the entire world, just go out there and write about trade stories. And so I would go to Cambodia and China and you name it. I was writing about trade spats, you know, in this place and that place. And I really wanted to do, you know, an Africa trade story, and there was nothing coming. I couldn't see anything. Every time I came up with a proposal, they're like, oh, it's too small. It's too much. It's small money. It's not like, you know, it's not the GATT agreement. It's not the China WTO where you're talking about billions and billions of dollars. You know, maybe Victoria's Secret is going to open up a factory in Madagascar. I actually went to Madagascar to the fact. I finally got my story, but it always at the Journal, it was, even though they wanted to cover it, they didn't like the fact that the money was so small, flipped us into writing about it as a quirky little type of offbeat story, and you end up oftentimes relegating these stories to, isn't this a fun, quirky little feature story about, you know, about this, that, and the other, and it loses the import. I think things are definitely going to be changing now, because there's just so much more money, and you're talking, it's not just Nigeria with oil, you've got it, you know, spreading around the continent, and things are getting, but I think it's still gonna be a long time before you see the type of robust coverage of trade and economic development in Africa that you see of trade in, say, China or Asia, just because Africa does not have that kind of money. You don't have the number of people. You can't, it's very hard for African countries to compete with the Chinese on a lot of these type of products. So it's viewed in a different way. And if you're looking at a newspaper like the FT or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, they're at the end of the day going to be looking for the bigger dollar numbers.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I just would like to agree with 2 things. First is, yes, bad news self-sell. You know, you don't need marketing for that. And the second thing is, indeed, if you only base this on numbers, you know, you don't have a compelling story necessarily. Because even with the Nigeria rebasing its economy, I mean, the continent is about 1.4, 1.5 trillion GDP. I mean, that's about France's GDP.
Yeah.
You know,
right.
So the numbers are not necessarily compelling, but there is an underlying story which is worth saying. I mean, that's all the human story which is there. Now, where I really think that there is hope is that people need to realize more and more that, you know, the media is not a perfect mirror. You know, you look at the mirror, and sometimes you see things there which are not true, but sometimes you see things which are ugly, and maybe it's because, like, you know, if you are ugly, then it gives you that picture too.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's not a perfect mirror.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I think we cannot change anything as long as we Africans do not frame our narrative. And that's really what it would boil down to, ultimately. You've got to frame the story.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not happy about the fact that our head of states and others didn't frame the story of this summit. And the second thing is we've got to get the chance to all the people out there who are on social media and others and who are doing a lot of work, sometimes even better than the media itself. And last point, when you really think about it, Africans, many of them look at the United States. And in the heads of many, there's also a lot of stereotypes. Drugs, a lot of it. Prostitution, a lot of it. Gunshots, and lot, and they can't comprehend it. So at the end of the day, this is also embedded in human nature. And it's, we've got to give a chance for this movement which has started to grow and that infuse everywhere. And the media has its role, citizens have their role, but our leadership also needs to do its job.
Yeah. Let me ask Akon, John, I'll come to you about the African culture. And in your work and in the media outlets that you see, do you see an increasingly accurate reflection of African culture? And I'm thinking music and art and fashion and other modes of expression.
With the human eye, I do, clearly, because I'm out there in those grounds and I can clearly see the advantages and the inspiration that inspires the rest of the world. But getting back to the media aspect of it, you really can't blame them. They're just the messengers. They report what they see, and us as humans, we have to evaluate that information and work with it. How does it benefit us? How does it not benefit us? But ultimately, we as a human race will never go forward if we put business and corporate gain before the fact of that you're human first. It's period. Like, people will sell any and everybody out for $1. There's no human value anymore. And that's what it boils down to, because as much money as the corporations and the media for itself, even what they report. I mean, corporations, of course, they do foundations, they try to give back, so on and so forth. But even in that game, it's more funneling funds back on how they can gain more money.
Yeah, but one of the things that we're seeing in Africa when some of our major corporations invest there is that they're creating jobs and they're creating skills.
That's what they say.
Well,
where are the jobs?
They're, firm like Procter & Gamble's created like 2,000 jobs there.
There's almost 1 billion people in Africa. 2,000 isn't doing nothing.
Got to start somewhere, right?
But think about it, right? Let's say every year we say we have to start somewhere. Then I go here, when I can literally employ tens of thousands, I employ a couple hundred. Can you imagine? But I don't even blame them, because as Africans, we shouldn't ever have to reach out to build our own country. There's enough money in Africa itself. And let me give you an example. And you can check the statistics. Every week there's a new millionaire coming out of Africa. Every 6 months there's a new billionaire. It's clear there's a lot of money in Africa, liquid cash. If we just bank in Africa, you know what? Let's not even help nobody in Africa ever again. All the rich millionaire Africans in Africa, from Africa in Africa, just bank in Africa. That alone will help build our own economy. You follow? But we don't even go that far.
Right.
And that's what hurts me more than anything, because it's like we're so dependent on our neighbors to help us when all we need is just each other.
Do you see that changing at all?
It's going to happen with the youth.
Getting better or getting worse?
I think the youth is the only thing that can do it. I don't think that this generation or generation before us can make that happen. It has to be the generation following. And we have to be able to teach them kids moving forward on how to not allow the history to hold you down and move forward. Because ultimately, if we continue to do what we're doing and follow our leaders in so many words, we're going to be right back here. It's like a 360 never-ending cycle.
Yeah.
And someone has to take the stand and just do what's necessary, more for the fact of you being human first. And it goes right back to, let's say, prime example. And this is not quite related to Africa, but the scenarios don't really change. The conflict in Gaza. it's clear that Palestine they can't afford a military to fight back. They don't have the resources that Israel have. So from the human nature, like the human part of it, you can't sit here and literally kill women and children and think it's okay because you think one rocket is going to kill or be sent out. To avoid 2 or 3 people dying, you're killing thousands of people. There's no human rationale to that to me. So as people, we have to think us first. Everything will come naturally if we just do the right thing amongst each other.
Yeah.
You follow what I'm saying?
Fair point. Let me pivot to John. You wanted to get involved in this. You want to jump in?
Well, maybe build on two points on this ongoing discussion. The first one is from our side of the equation, this idea of generating more development through retaining that money in Africa is a compelling one. And part of the equation, perhaps, is all of the work that is being done on the continent of Africa and with its partners on battling corruption. And corruption being a two-way street, that so much of the money that has come in and corrupted certain elites in African governments have been as a result of huge investments, very untransparent investments from the United States and from Europe and certain Asian countries. And the move now increasingly towards more transparency, more accountability for money that has been diverted away from state budgets that would go into health and education and all forms of social welfare, capital development, and infrastructure. And so I think that's one piece of the puzzle as well that we need to talk about. And secondly, on the media stuff, everybody's correct. The world is going to keep focusing on, if it bleeds, it leads, no matter where you are. Whether you're in St. Louis and you watch the nightly news in St. Louis, they're going to cover who got shot that day.
Absolutely.
And the world news is going to cover where the bang is blowing up the loudest. Yeah. But here's the point. You can cover these stories in a way that changes people's perceptions. Usually, when we see a sort of a nightly news version of an African conflict, they're going to run straight to the one white aid worker, and interview them, yeah, because our audience has to be able to identify with this, yeah, story. Whereas the truth of every crisis response in Africa is that it's led and staffed and organized by Africans. You think about the humanitarian assistance infrastructure of responding to all the emergencies that we see. 99% of the people that are working in these crises, in these very difficult situations, very dangerous situations, are Africans, putting their lives on the line. When you look at the park rangers who are protecting the wildlife from being poached, it's Africans. When you look at who is on the front lines of human rights struggles and pro-democracy struggles, it's the Africans in the streets saying we want to see change in our country. And the healthcare workers, even in West Africa this week, if you can see who's really bearing the brunt of the horrors that is under because of the public health crisis there in certain countries. So I think covering a story, they're going to cover those stories, but covering it in a way that values and demonstrates that Africans are at the core of the solution, not just the problem. That would be very helpful.
So Amadou, the nightly news in Nairobi, is it reported in the same way? Does it lead with who was shot today? Or what bank was robbed? Or is it different? Or in Dakar?
I mean, it's probably different. Yeah. But Whitney, at the end of the day, and John, if you were here, you live here within the United States and the nightly news, the anchor is reporting for an American agents, for God's sake. The identification is done by, the American doctor victim of Ebola flown back here. That's where the empathy is more than like the Liberian doctor who saved, hundreds of lives and who ended up dying. I mean, that's just the plain reality, and everybody knows that in news, you're also competing to have viewership. So, it's natural, and that's why we've got to go back to basics. Let's make sure that we have the professional journalists, and let's make sure that we have the infrastructure which enables Africans to tell that own story, so that if you're in the United States of America and you're interested in what's going on, the story of that doctor in Liberia, you can get it.
Yeah.
You know, so that's where I come out of this, you know. So,
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that's taking too much of the onus away from, you know, what people in the Western media can be doing. I don't see that sort of looking for the American angle when people are writing about China, or when people are writing about, you know, when we write about Pakistan, and we write about Afghanistan, and we write about anywhere else except for Africa. I think
it's
tend
there.
to. I don't think. I certainly
No,
don't see it with
I
Europe.
very much agree with you. I think there is
we tend to do it with Africa. With Africa, we got to find an American angle. I don't see us doing that with anywhere else.
so
And
why is that so? Now we've got to ask ourselves, why is that so? And then we find the answer.
And I think the answer would probably be that we still see this is now we Americans still seeing we Africans.
You're moving around a lot in that chair.
We Americans still see we Africans as very foreign and different, and somehow
We don't understand Africa.
we're not.
And we are.
But if you were a historian in 100 years' time, looking at trying to figure out what happened in since the millennium, and you use the Western media as your gauge, you would actually miss the story. You would think that the continent was racked by conflict, that you wouldn't realize that actually there's been this extraordinary transformation going on. And that is something very specific to the way Africa is reported, because it's certainly not the case in Asia. That you get a much broader, better picture of what's actually happening.
You tell a vignette in your book, The House at Sugar Beach, about when you were working for Wall Street Journal and you came to Washington and you were going to go on Ron Brown's trip to China, and you gave your Liberian passport to the Commerce Department. And the woman came back to you and she said, "I've never seen one of these. Is this real?" And I can only imagine how you felt. You said at the time it encouraged you to get your American citizenship and passport, but has it gotten any better? Do you think we know Africa at all?
I think
Would that happen again today?
yes and no. It's definitely gotten better. This was in the 90s when Liberia was in the middle of a civil war.
Yeah.
And so Liberia right now is 50,000 times better than it was in the 90s when we were in the middle of a civil war with child soldiers, with so many, I mean, the carnage was unbelievable. That said, it's still a very rare thing. I was traveling with my sister a few years ago. We're on a train, overnight train, going from England to, we're going from Paris to Florence, Italy. And I don't know, don't ask me why we took the train, I can't even remember. But I had my American passport, my sister still had a Liberian passport. And it was the middle of the night, and they stopped the train when we got to the border and came into the cabin we were in and dragged her out there with her Liberian passport. And you know, the border immigration guys were just basically like examining her passport again as if it was some kind of exotic thing that they'd never seen before, and shining the flashlight. And I remember cracking up that night when she finally came back into the compartment an hour later, pissed. Yeah. I mean, she was furious, but it was like that was sort of par for the course, as you know. But I think that was still, even that was before, that was still right around the end of the Liberian Civil War. I think things are very different now, and I think it's become a lot more. I'd like to believe it's become a lot more sort of normal and usual to see people from all different countries in Africa moving about far more freely. But I will tell you that, you know, one of the reasons I became an American citizen was that I didn't want the visa hassle anymore. I just, having to fill out a visa to go to there was not a single country I could go to except for, you know, the ECOWAS ones, where I didn't spend 2 weeks in, like, at various embassies, like, in visa hell. And that's a really horrible reason to become an American citizen.
The reasons and the reasons. Good outcome. But one last question before I open to the floor, and that is, does anybody think that the Africa Leaders Summit is going to change American perceptions of Africa?
No.
Nope.
No.
I agree with Amadou that there's been insufficient framing of the story by the African political leadership coming here.
Yeah.
But I also think that it's a real marker that this summit is taking place,
Yeah.
and there's a real buzz about it.
Yeah, very much. Do you want to add anything?
Great is happening. I don't think it would change much.
Yeah.
I mean, the change happens what, you know, all of us individually we do on a daily basis, not because of the summit, which is a great summit, by the way.
John, you see it from both sides, inside government and outside government. Does this change?
So I think it marginally improves things. You get from President Clinton to President Bush to President Obama all investing some of their efforts of their presidency in enhancing a different type of relationship between Africa and the United States, more equal, more of a partnership. It's one very small step on a long road that needs to be taken.
Nakon, what do you think?
No, absolutely, I agree with John. But more so, I think that it's a way to pretty much make up for what could be done. That's how it feels.
Yeah.
You know, because this is not the only place that a summit like this was held for Africa. It's 6 times a year.
Right.
Everywhere, Ghana, Ethiopia, you name it. Gabon, here, Saudi, Qatar, Dubai. But we can have 1 million summits. If Africans themselves don't rebuild their own country, it's going to be 1 million more summits.
Great. So let me open up to some questions here. I met last week a Mandela Washington Fellow, youth leader, children.
Yes, I'll try to speak out loud. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Please say your name and where you're from.
My name is Chedi Ngulu. I come from the United Republic of Tanzania. I've been attending the Obama's Washington Fellowship for Young African Leaders. I've been doing business and entrepreneurship track, and I was lucky to receive the USDF YAL Entrepreneurship Grant. In so many ways, my story is a story of so many other young people in Africa. Not just in the struggle of trying to reshape the image of our continent, but to also a push for growth and prosperity. And just to hint a few is where older people, older generations say that this is how it's done, we say it can be better. Where we start our own businesses with a new energy and focus. We're optimistic than the pessimism that exists with the older generation and the international community about Africa. We make 75% of the population. We're waking up to the realization of how much we can actually change the politics, the businesses, and actually drive tangible change. The question I want to throw back to the panel has to do with the U.S. Africa relations. And basically, United States in Africa has a reputation of having permanent interests and not permanent friends. So for some of us who are attending the summit, you know, I've been constantly receiving warnings that, what are you doing there? What are those Americans trying to put in your heads? And I've constantly have to remind people back home that I am making friends with the United States. I'm trying to build international relations, which is in the best interest of the continent, but I'm not selling out my country. So the question to you is, what is the United States doing to get past this reputation? We've been talking about media here. A lot of people back home don't buy a lot of stuff that been discussed here because they think that you pick stories, you pick angles that work best for the American and the international interests than the local context. We think we have a lot of good stories. Yeah, we're the first generation to access high tech now. We don't just download Akon music. By the way, I'm honored to meet you. But but we also share our stories. So we tell our American friends that Africa is not all a jungle and diseases and wars. We have happiness in cities like Dar es Salaam, Nairobi, and Lagos. That is a positive aspect. So what I'm trying to ask here is, what is America trying to do to get past this bad reputation? And even more importantly, to what extent is America willing to treat Africa as equal and avoid bad branding or punitive measures when Africa decides to act in its best interest? Thank you.
John, let me throw that to you from having worked in the White House and the State Department.
Well, one of the things that isn't really being featured a lot in this summit, but is one of the things that I think the United States has invested a lot in the last few years, is in crisis response and the crisis response capabilities of African institutions. And look at peacekeeping and peace enforcement operations that the United States has invested quite a lot in, building up the capacities of African militaries that can be the first responders to some of the worst crises. You look at some of the peace, I mean, in every conflict in Africa today, the principal negotiators, the principal peacemakers are Africans. And so I think the United States has instead of trying to Bigfoot that, as we might have during the Cold War and the period thereafter, the U.S. has, I think, helpfully worked in support of African solutions for some of these conflicts and build up the capacity of not only the African Union and its peacemaking abilities, but also the sub-regional organizations, ECOWAS and IGAD in Eastern Africa and the Southern Africa Development, SADC, I always forget what the C stands for. So I think that's some part of a less told story that the United States, they don't really get anything out of it. Yeah. Like I think a lot of the trade and investment stuff, the U.S. benefits greatly, and it's an incredibly important agenda, and I think a lot of people wonder, well, why is the U.S. trying to invest in this? And they're curious and perhaps even concerned about what American corporate interests might have in Africa. But there's a whole other element of peacemaking, peacekeeping, and humanitarian response, public health, development, education support, all these kinds of things that the United States is involved in as well that I think is hopefully will lay a stronger foundation for the relationship between the United States and the African continent.
Right, that's great. Let me take some more over here, in the back there. Why don't I take two?
Hi, I'm Kate Thompson from Deloitte. Going back to the question about Africa's own journalists, I believe that storytellers shape our world. And when I look at the journalism in Africa, I think of it as a supply problem and a demand problem. That citizens don't demand better coverage from their journalists, and journalists don't have access to information from their governments. And in some cases, they don't have perhaps the professional training or skills to analyze some of the information and the data that they're receiving. So the question is to sort of the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times and others is, what are we doing to help African storytellers, African journalists, African media tell their own story that you've all sort of mentioned? What are we practically doing to help that? Why doesn't the Financial Times hire more African journalists, for example?
Great. Let me take it over there.
It's a great question.
Thank you very much. My question is, Africa is...
Can you identify yourself?
Sure.
Thank
Heather
you.
Jeffen, consulting firm. And the African is very rich country and should attract tourism. Not a single organization in the United States promote African tourism. And believe me, I went there, invited by a friend of mine in Kenya. It's fascinating. I mean, I have never seen anything like it in Europe, Asia, or Latin America. But why don't we promote tourism? And that's really what gets American to know African and to know the culture and to all what you have to do, promote tourism and then kind of work on make it safe for them to come and enjoy being in Africa, enjoy the beautiful continent.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, I can answer that one right there. I know a number of travel agents that would love to take you to Africa. So see me afterwards and I'll give you their names. Yeah, over there, please.
Hi, yes, my name is Natalie Madeira Cofield. I'm the president and CEO of the Greater Austin Black Chamber of Commerce. One of the things that I did want to mention is that Texas is actually the largest exporter to Africa from a Brookings report that was done with more than $5 billion worth of exports to the continent. And so as we're talking about reframing and recreating a narrative about what it means to do business in Africa, I'd love for us to kind of really push back on some of the comments that I've heard about the fact that there is a lot of coverage being done about trade, because there's not. There's a lot more coverage being done around aid to Africa. And I think if we change the conversation to look at Africa as a growth opportunity, as a market opportunity, as why aren't you investing in Africa, versus why you should invest in Africa, I think it would really do our country a service. And so with that being said, my question is, Austin is obviously one of the fastest growing technology centers in the country. Africa is one of the fastest growing technology continents in the world. How do we continue to keep pushing this conversation about trade and entrepreneurship on the continent, looking at it from a tech perspective in this instance? That's a great story.
That's a great question. And was there one more? Did I see one over here? Betty.
Thank you very much. My name is Betty Minor from Kenya, and I have two comments about this. I went to a meeting last week on Friday, and I mean this absence of proper presentation of Africa, I think, does a lot of disservice to American investments or potential investments. And part of the conversation was mostly a couple of business people. Their perception is that Africa is not open to them for business because it's been taken over by the Chinese, because they don't care about human rights. The other narrative was they don't do business in Africa because the Europeans bribe. But that's really that's not true to start with. But if the American media doesn't change its perception of Africa, it's only going to be to the loss of American businesses. The panel before, I think we had General Electric say that in 5 years, their orders have grown from $1 billion to $3 billion. So there are some people who probably don't know, are doing great business in Africa, and may not be able to tell the rest, at least to be able to change the perceptions. I think it would also be interesting to see whether the American media sees itself as having a role in changing that perception. It could be the role of African leaders, I agree, but I think there is also a lot to be done by the American media to actually change this perception and make sure that the American people are aware of the dynamism in the continent. And having said that, I think the panelists all said, is the Africa Summit going to change anything? You all said no. Well, actually, there's been a lot more debate, certainly in my part of the world, there's been a lot more conversation about this summit than about the Europe-Africa Summit that happened in April. There are more people from my country here in Washington this week than went to Brussels. So there must be something to be said about all the hype and the conversation about this. So I think a lot will, not necessarily a lot will change, but certainly the level of conversations and debates and write-ups is a lot more about this summit than happened just 4 months ago. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. William, first question to you. Why doesn't the FT hire more African writers or train African writers?
Well, first of all, it should. Second of all, there is a slightly complex issue, which is quite often it is actually better to have a foreign correspondent who is actually a foreign correspondent. So, for example, if we're covering West Africa, it's not a bad idea to have an English guy or an American, just as it would be anywhere else in the world, because you have a kind of that outside perspective on things. So that's one issue. But it's true that we haven't hired that many African journalists over time, although we have hired some. So there's room for improvement on that. But the other part of the question, I rather disagree with the premise in a way that we should be helping African media, because actually it's evolving incredibly fast. And when I first became a journalist, I worked for the BBC African service, Focus on Africa. Tens of millions of people listened to it all across Africa. It was a vital daily news media. Now, very few people listen to it. They don't need to. There's so many African radios, TV channels. So in a way, I think the media is evolving incredibly fast in Africa. Not always in a positive direction. Yeah. Some newspapers have deteriorated in quality. But generally, the landscape has changed massively. And I don't think, outsiders have much to offer, really. I mean, it's doing it itself.
Amadou, what's your take on that?
To my sister Betty, for my part, I just want to qualify why I thought it doesn't change anything. Yeah. For instance, if you take the France-Africa summit, it's been happening for years. The perception of France towards Africa and Francophone Africa is probably today, worse. I mean, you can measure it by the levels of gain of the Front National, for instance, just to pack that. Now, it's great that many people are coming here, including from Kenya, but that's also because there is probably some promise in here. It's new. This is the first, at this level, summit between the U.S. as a country and Africa as a continent. So there's a lot of hope in that. Yeah. So second point, I just want to say there's always be bad excuses for not going to Africa. I'm talking about the business. Yeah. And indeed, they're losing out. Look, if you actually take the, China-Africa relation, it's not new. And of course, the former colonial powers and African relation is not new. But before today, American companies which are not going to Africa saying, well, everything goes to China. They used to say, well, everything goes to the former colonial power. So, there are always bad excuses. The thing is, indeed, if you don't go, then you're in the losing end of this. So, and it is probably public service for media to actually also, media from this side of the world, frame the story for American companies to say, well, you know what, you can do better by going to Africa. So that's really what it is.
Can I just add something to that? I think one of the great ironies right now is that the great kind of frontier capitalism that built this country, that is so American, is actually, it's the Chinese who are doing it in Africa. American companies really aren't getting in there, getting their hands dirty, building railways. It's the Chinese who've inherited that.
I'd like to just insert something, though, on this great Chinese in Africa story that we consistently hear. I don't think it is necessarily all roses. I think that we get that here because we're constantly, we're told, the Chinese are beating the Americans, and they are in Africa, obviously. But I think that comes with a lot of damage, societal damage, and it comes with a lot of cultural damage. Right. I have an anecdote I just want to fling out there. I spent much of last year in Liberia. I was working on a book, and the Chinese are, Liberia was founded by freed slaves from America. Liberia should be the ultimate American story. But China is big time in Liberia. There's this whole narrative that China has completely overtaken, and in many ways they have, the United States in Liberia. But the Chinese government have been, and these Chinese companies were working on a fourth or fifth university. It would be part, an adjunct of the University of Liberia, just outside of Monrovia. And they built what they build as this beautiful campus, dormitories and all of that. And the University of Liberia is very overcrowded. And for the bathrooms, the Chinese built, there's this big controversy in Liberia because they built these outside toilets that are basically just holes in the ground. And the Liberian students refused to use them. They just like did. And there was this big deal with why did the Chinese build these toilets? There aren't real commodes, not real toilets. They just built these things, and this is just basically, but this is Africa. I mean, people should be used to going to the bathroom with a hole in the ground. There was this huge controversy for 2 years now, these dorms are sitting there empty, not being used by a ravenous population because you have this sort of cultural conflict there. And I remember getting into a big fight with a Greek friend of mine who's like, this is insane. How can why are the Liberian students, they don't have schools to go to, why are they not? And I kept trying to explain, but you don't understand, they feel insulted. There's a lot, they spent all millions of dollars building this, why couldn't they just put in proper bathrooms? And there's a lot often these disconnections between these cultures that we don't see these sorts of stories here in the United States. But it's not, all I would say is that I was just struck by
Sounds like
how
a good story.
It would be a great story, but I don't write about Liberia for the New York Times.
One of those quirky ones.
That's a quirky story. But it's very much a case of when we're here looking at it, it looks as if China has completely taken over. And I just think all of that comes with there's a lot of prejudice right now between Africans and the Chinese on both sides of the issue. There's a lot of suspicion. There's a lot of, it's not, and I just think we shouldn't whitewash it when we talk about it here. We should have our eyes should be open when American companies and American organizations go to these countries, and we should also be aware that it's not as if other people don't have issues as well.
Right.
No, I'm sorry. I think in any situation, there's going to be a good and a bad to the situation. Like, I just left China, and I went into a facility where their bathrooms was hole in the ground. So that's their culture. It wasn't that they did anything disrespectful. That's their culture. Now, the Liberian culture and the Chinese culture are similar when it comes to history and family and stories. They're kind of similar, but the way of how they live, their diet, things of that nature, is kind of different from ours. So I think a lot of times it's always a misunderstanding or miscommunication because we don't communicate enough as a human race. So ultimately, anywhere you go in the world, there's going to be parts of cultures that you may not be, experienced with. Like, in me being in America and learning here, I've realized just how much I need to know, because when I first came to this country, I spoke fluent French, spoke fluent Wolof, and came to the US and learned English. But I was so busy learning English that I lost my French, because no one speaks nothing here but English. The only reason why I still speak Wolof is because we spoke Wolof at home. But I don't see how you can be in a position where everything is catered. Like, that's the only thing that I think that U.S. can expand on and I think be better with is educating Americans to the outside world. And I think Africa has always been one of those continents where it's almost like if there was even remotely close conversation about education to Africa, they shut it down. There's a lot more to Africa that needs to be learned, even in the schools, because even when you look at American history, Africa's played a huge role building America, but you would never even know that. So it goes all the way back down. Now, getting back to China itself, the only reason why they feel like China is taking over Africa is because they really are. It's true. And I can say this because I'm a born American, so that makes me an American citizen. As we were traveling all through, with my Acon Lighting Africa project, we have 14 countries that we're locked into contract, supplying smart homes, street lights. But it's ironic that I'm an American citizen and I'm being funded by the Chinese. It's not that U.S. don't have the opportunity, don't have the respect, don't have the manpower, don't have the experience to do it. I just feel personally that there's not enough interest in Africa yet for U.S. to put their hands in there. Because ultimately, they have the power to do it, walk in right now and be out of there, and Africa could be amazing with that partnership. Because I think if U.S. and Africa actually really joined forces and created the United States of Africa, this would actually empower and strengthen America a lot more, believe it or not. And I think she might have left, but she's absolutely right. Not investing in Africa at this point will completely disable U.S. in the future, because what Africa has to offer that Chinese now is taking advantage of, and you see how fast China is building. But if they actually have Africa on top of what they're already building, they will become the world's new superpower. So it's a question of, do you get involved now, or do you just wait and be very arrogant and allow that to happen and then come back later and realize, wow, we made a mistake. It goes right back to the music industry. And I like to relate a lot of things with the music industry because it's almost like it reflects reality. The music industry was so powerful at one point. Everyone needed a record deal to be famous. Digital came on board. So it wasn't really a threat yet. Because it's digital, no one really understands it quietly. How does it make money? We quite don't know yet, but just give it a minute. So while that's happening, you have a small company called Apple who's creating what could be the next music industry. They go to someone like a Universal, Sony, Warner Brothers, all these guys, and says, listen, we have a new format that may work for you. What do you think? Oh, well, we don't really understand that. Okay, well, how can we license your music and sell it on our platform? Oh, well, you know what? You can just take it. Whatever helps us sell more records, we're cool. Have it. They give up the whole catalog to Apple. Apple creates iTunes. Now, everything that you buy related to music, entertainment, movies, film, you name it, you have to go to the iTunes to download it and actually own access to content that Universal spends millions and billions of dollars creating so that they can get 30% of what Apple makes, 70% of what they're making. So they literally came and took over the music business because they didn't see tomorrow.
Hey, Khan, let me just pivot for a second because we're running out of time. I want to bring it back to Africa. And I want to convey a Twitter question that we've had. And this is to you, Amadou. What is being done to bridge the gap between Africans in the continent and those in the diaspora? And can media play a role in this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think actually, every day, and I'm sure, Akan would do this too, every day you go, being in the diaspora, I haven't lived in Senegal in a very long time, you get news and information online from your own country every day. And media is doing that. I mean, almost every African country has one or two, three flagship websites. That's, of course, on top of all Africa, as you know, but it's there. So media is playing that role, and it would keep growing that way.
Yeah, okay. I think we have time for just a couple more questions right here.
Amadou Daffy, founder of Chorus for Africa, and this question is for Akan and Amadou. I'm a technologist, and we have an army of developers in Africa. We're constantly thinking about creating something to own that content and navigate it through. But because we are so bounded into our technology mind, we don't know what to do. What kind of focus, what is the media focus we should be basically focusing on?
Well,
yeah. Wait, let me take two more. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Go ahead over here.
My name is Abdel Maliki, and I'm from GCI. My question to the panelists, and you kind of touched about it a few minutes ago, but you didn't go deeper. The first FDI from Africa to United States, it's the diaspora who's here. And so far is not utilizing to its full potential to change what you're all talking about as the narrative about Africa. We all in this room has been to all those leaders of this country, and when you get to the person in charge of Africa, you see the American guy who been on the continent 1 or 2 times and write a book about it, but doesn't have all the perspective that the diaspora people have here. So how can we, people in this room, make that change happen, that America can use the real African who's American, who's here, and can tell them what really happening on the continent or what really matters as a change that we are looking for. And I want an opinion from the panelists.
Good question. And there's one more question over here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think my name is Joshua. I come from Kenya. I think we operate in a region where perhaps covering over 250 million people within Eastern, Central, and Southern Africa today. I think my question back to the panelists, I think Amadou and maybe Akon, is wherever the stories we write, I mean, I'm a proud African, I live in the continent. We continue to run the race of transforming the continent today, whether you write differently. I think the question for me, which you spoke earlier in the last panel, was around the technology revolution on data and voice. You have 500 million people connected in the continent, shaping the conversations happening today. A huge opportunity for investment, whether you're looking at, and we have a lot of American investors today we see in our markets, capital markets, equity market, debt markets. Is there a chance to be able to, it's a complex continent, I agree. It's very complex, 55 countries, it's not one story. One is positive in Nigeria, is negative in another country, and it will be like that for a long time. Sometimes we want to say it's one continent, one Africa. It's not one Africa for us. Every single country from Abidjan, from Zaire, it's different. So is there a chance to see, and I love what Amadou is doing, are we able to see utilizing that technology platform to shape the stories that transforms the continent?
So we just have a couple minutes, so why don't we just go down the panel and everybody can respond to some of those questions, make some final comments on what we've heard. Akon, we'll start with you.
Which question first?
Well, there's several questions that were put to you. One about technology and how that can be utilized.
Oh, absolutely. On what technology you think you should start, right? I would start with mobile. Because right now, mobile handhelds is the key communication for Africa. Anything that you can operate from your phone, you'll win. So create apps that you can actually use on dumb phones and smartphones. Because a lot of the rural areas, they don't have smartphones. But there's a minimized type of technology that creates apps that can utilize technologies that actually work with smartphones, or more just to be able to communicate in other ways. But I think any business revenue that you have that can operate from a cell phone, you can actually win in Africa, for sure.
Great. John, do you want to respond to any of those or anything else?
I'm just going to ask you if you can help me make this.
Oh, you got a BlackBerry?
Dumb phone be a little smarter. I got something to talk to you about after. Man, oh man, but I'm one of those loyalists. I can't let go. I'm a dinosaur. The BlackBerry. You another one too? Ooh. Anyways, I was going to try to answer the diaspora question, only to say that in the 30 years that I've sort of been involved in politics in the American system and in policy making on Africa, it is very powerful when African constituencies in the diaspora work together.
Absolutely.
And come together around specific issues. I go all the way back to Somalia in the late 1980s, where they helped dismantle the dictatorship of Siad Barre. Now, they couldn't anticipate what came after that, but the power of Somali Americans working together in congressional district after congressional district made a big impression on me, and I've seen that replicated many, many times over the last 25, 30 years. And I think about the trade agreement between the United States and Africa that needs to be renewed in the coming year, and for Africans to come together for that name of which is
AGOA.
AGOA, sorry, African Growth and Opportunity Act. Coming behind that, I think about the way the Lost Boys and other South Sudanese people were sent all throughout the United States in their reintegration journeys, getting asylum in the U.S., and how they're politically very important in each little congressional district that they live in now. And when they come together, they're very divided right now, but when they come together, the impact they can have on the United States foreign policy and peace in South Sudan can be incredible. The Congolese American diaspora and how much of an impact. They were so divided for so long, but when the Dodd-Frank bill came along, and it was a provision in there that said, okay, we just want American companies to divulge and be transparent about the investments that they're making in Africa, the companies that are listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Just be open and honest about how you're getting your resources downstream in your supply chains. Congolese Americans came together and had a big impact, congressional district by congressional district. So it's that unity, really, that in diversity, that the impact, that the raw possibilities of that impact resides.
Right. You know, just add a footnote, in 2008, the Obama campaign, I remember we're going in district after district, talking to diaspora communities. And it didn't even matter if they were Americans or not, because even if they weren't, they knew somebody who was, and they could get out the vote. And it was just incredibly electric, and I think that power can be replicated over and over again.
Absolutely.
Amadou, let me come to you for
a
thought here.
Thanks, Whitney. Just want to end by saying, of course, we hear all the time that necessity is a matter of invention, which is true, particularly in Africa, because of all the needs and creativity. But at the same time, what I usually say is desperation is a mother of action. And when you look at, my good brother there, what he was talking about, like, how to use American companies more in Africa, or use people here. When they're stuck in the middle and know that there is here knowledge and talent they can use to get them ahead, because they're losing ground more and more, they will do it. So when they become desperate, they'll go to action. And I think, the outlook for me is great. And I really want to end it there. Outlook is great for Africa. There's still a lot of work to be done, but it's all of us in this room and our kids who would really ultimately finish it.
Yeah, great, thank you. William?
Just speaking about the diaspora, one of the slightly less told stories actually is the number of Africans in the diaspora who are actually going back to take advantage of opportunities in places like Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Zambia. But I think to take it right back to how you started, this sort of complex picture that comes out of the continent, it's amazing that you've got that trend alongside this extraordinary kind of exodus where tens of thousands of people are marching across the Sahara Desert into, in many cases, a watery grave in the Mediterranean. I think that those two trends actually rather sum up what's happening on the continent today. There are still places where people are really suffering and desperate, but you've also got these tremendous opportunities which are bringing the diaspora back.
Yeah, incredibly complex picture. Helene, I don't know which side of the chair you want to sit on.
I'm going to sit on all three. I think we had a question earlier just about the whole idea of how to get the African story across, and I think the Western news media part of me says that we at the New York Times and the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal and all these institutions, these news institutions, really need to do a better job of finding Africans to tell their stories. Ditto for Hollywood and for TV. And then the African in me says that we have to find a better way of telling our own stories as Africans and doing it ourselves. This is a job for us. It shouldn't be Africans relying on the New York Times to tell our story. We should be taking charge of our own destiny and telling the world what we have to say. And then the American in me says that we also here, those Americans who have an interest in Africa should read those stories. Go out and buy Chimamanda Adichie's book, Americana. Go and buy Taye Selassie's Ghana Must Go. Read them, support this burgeoning group of African writers who are fantastic.
Yeah, here. Yeah. Well, we've gone over our time, and before we depart, just let me say there's a reception after this immediately. Drew, where is it? Right next door. So please come and join us, and let me thank the panelists for really your willingness to come on and sort of tackle a subject that's not often taken on and not easily discussed. But I